Yeah, I know. Rogue One is a standalone film, and the Machete Order is just about the main episodes, so Rogue One isn't supposed to fit. But I've actually taken that all into consideration, and I think we can all agree that Rogue One is a good film. Significantly better than another film that might be included in the Machete Order. So when I watch Star Wars in the future, or if I'm showing someone Star Wars for the first time, I'm going to want Rogue One to be in there as well. Hello there! How are you doing? I'm assuming you've probably seen Rogue One if you're watching this video, but if you haven't, there are going to be spoilers in this video, so you've been warned. For those of you who don't know what the Machete Order is, it's basically just a way of watching Star Wars. Arguably the best way to watch Star Wars if you're watching Star Wars for the first time. Which I'm assuming none of you are since you're watching this video. But if you were to show Star Wars to someone who, God forbid, had never seen it, this would be the order some people, including me, would recommend that person watch it in. So the Machete Order recommends you watch Star Wars in the order of A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, Return of the Jedi. And then I guess The Force Awakens comes after that. The article was written in 2011, so yeah. And yes, that completely leaves out the irrelevant Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Because despite that Qui-Gon Jinn and Darth Maul are kinda cool, most people agree it's a terrible movie, especially with the inclusion of Jar Jar Binks. And if you leave out The Phantom Menace, you get rid of Jar Jar Binks. Well, mostly. There's a link to the original article on the Machete Order in the description that was written in 2011, and I highly recommend you go check it out. So now the question is, how does Rogue One fit into the Machete Order? And it's an interesting one, because it takes place directly before Episode 4 or A New Hope. And that was honestly my favourite part of the film, the way it leads so perfectly into A New Hope. Particularly with the last line where Leia simply says, "Hope." But A New Hope is also the first film in the Machete Order. Which would mean that if we were to include Rogue One in the Machete Order, it would come first. And this does make sense because they just slide into each other so perfectly. But I wouldn't recommend it because Rogue One is just so different to all the other Star Wars movies. It doesn't have the opening crawl of text at the start. There are very few mentions of the Jedi or the dark side. There's no real explanation to what the Force is despite being mentioned a couple times. And the only real uses of the Force are by Darth Vader and Chirrut Imwe, I have no idea how to pronounce his name, you know, like the Force using Daredevil in the film.
All is as the Force wills it.
And also, there are no lightsaber duels in this film. Like, realistically, if you haven't seen any Star Wars films previous to it, would it have even made sense? And of course, this is a standalone film and doesn't really have that much to do with any of the other films, you know, except for A New Hope. So I think if someone was to watch Star Wars for the first time, the appropriate place to start would be where it all started, you know, with A New Hope. However, I do want to argue that if you've seen it all before, which I'm assuming you have, Rogue One is the appropriate place to start. But of course, this order doesn't work for people who have never seen Star Wars before, so here are some orders for them. The first order is just to, of course, scrap the Machete Order and watch them all chronologically. And despite this one kind of working, since Rogue One and A New Hope fit together so well, I'm not a fan of it. Because firstly, you miss the big reveal.
I am your father.
And also, the prequels are mostly just backstory to 4, 5, and 6. Because it's the story of how Anakin turned to the dark side and became Darth Vader. And Rogue One is just backstory to A New Hope, because it's the story of how the rebels got the plans to the Death Star. So therefore, if you watch it chronologically, the first 4 films are almost entirely backstory. So I wouldn't recommend that either. Now, I think the most obvious solution is just to watch Star Wars in the Machete Order and watch Rogue One at the end once you've finished. And this one isn't actually a bad idea. Watch the main episodes and then go and watch Rogue One once you're done, since it's a standalone film and isn't actually part of the main episodical series. And this will probably come to be the way as more standalone films like the Han Solo standalone film come out upon the horizon. However, as I said earlier, Rogue One leads on perfectly into A New Hope. And honestly, it doesn't have a very satisfying ending unless it's immediately preceded by A New Hope. Since literally any character you had any sort of affection for in this film dies at the end. Well, you know, except Darth Vader. And in my opinion, this doesn't make the cut for the perfect end to the saga in the way that I hope Episode 9 will. Now, the next 2 choices are much more creative and really cut up the saga again. The first of these would be to keep the Machete Order and stick it in between Episodes 6 and 7. And this is actually, in my opinion, the best so far. Because The Force Awakens is very similar to A New Hope, and Rogue One fits in very well with A New Hope, so it should fit in similarly well with The Force Awakens. Since the whole idea of A New Hope is reintroduced through Rey rather than Luke this time, and the plots of the films are rather similar when it comes down to it. However, there is also the problem of just seeing Darth Vader die, and then being reintroduced to him when he's at his best, and then being told he's dead again. And then there's also the fact that this film is really nothing to do with episode 6 or 7, and is kind of just unnecessary backstory in between them. But other than that, Rogue One does fit in relatively well in between episodes 6 and 7. And the final possibility, and my personal favourite, is to slot it in between episodes 3 and 6. Why? Well, because chronologically, Rogue One comes after Revenge of the Sith. And despite everything I've said about how it fits in perfectly before A New Hope, it also slides in really well before Revenge of the Sith as well. We've just seen Anakin turn to the dark side, the film ends with the scene of Sidious and Vader looking up at the Death Star, and then we get to see a film all about the Death Star and Darth Vader in his prime. If there's one thing you want to see after watching Revenge of the Sith, is some awesome Vader scenes, and that is one thing Rogue One can bring to the table. Specifically that scene at the end where he literally takes on an entire ship of rebels on his own. And despite not leading perfectly into the next film like it does with A New Hope, Rogue One does lead into Return of the Jedi relatively nicely. And it arguably leads into Return of the Jedi in a better way than Revenge of the Sith did in the original Machete Order. And then after Return of the Jedi, you can go watch The Force Awakens in Episode 8 and Episode 9 when they come out. Then the only question is, how will the other standalone films fit? Particularly the Han Solo one coming out in 2018. Obviously these orders, and this one being the best one, is just my opinion. If there are any orders that you think I've missed out that are better than this one, please let me know down in the comments section below, because I'd really like to know what you guys think. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, and click subscribe by clicking here, and go watch more Star Wars content by clicking here. I know there aren't many Star Wars videos on my channel, but that's mostly because they don't get as many views as my Harry Potter videos or my Pixar videos, so if this video does well, maybe there will be more Star Wars videos on my channel, because I do love Star Wars.